patterns come out of St. Louis. How many patterns come out of Topeka, Kansas. And what we began to see is that the scaling relationships for things that were social in nature. Let me just get to the plot. You can see a lot of scatter plots, which is in the presentation, which I think is going to be made available. The main thing we found is for things of a social nature, we found a scaling coefficient. It was in the order between 1 and 1.5, meaning it's not surprising that larger places, let's say, create more wealth. Well, you have more people in Chicago than Topeka. It stands to reason there's going to be more wealth creation in Chicago than in Topeka. The interesting question is, but is the increase just simply proportional? More people, more wealth creation, more ideas, more patents, more startups, more firms being created, more homicides, more murders, more stealing. Is the increase just proportional, or is the increase greater than 1, greater than proportionality? Mathematically, you would call that superlinear scaling. And what we found is that for a lot of the social outputs of the city, whether they be good or bad, meaning crime is a social interaction, we found a coefficient that was in the order of 1 to 1.15, 1.2. For material infrastructure, we found that the relationship was sublinear. That, of course, also makes sense. As the city gets larger, you actually, one of the reasons why cities exist is because they economize. There's economies of scale to infrastructure. But then we found a lot of relationships that weren't the scale linear. So the fact that we found these 3 different regimes, the fact that the scale, well, first that we found scaling, but second, that we found 3 regimes, began to suggest to us, for mathematical reasons that I will skip for now, but it will be fun to go into, began to suggest to us that underlying these processes are networks. Because by now, one of the scaling relationships were very much the subject of study by applied mathematicians in the latter part of the 20th century for a variety of reasons. And we now have very good reason to believe that wherever you find a scaling relationship, there's probably an underlying network structure. Or to put it differently, scaling is usually an empirical footprint that you have a network phenomena at work. It's not easy to get scaling relations out of, let's say, ordinary differential equations or even partial differential equations. Very, very, very hard. So by now, applied mathematicians believe if you have scaling, there's probably a network hiding somewhere. Of course, you have to uncover the network and characterize it. So we were wrong, of course, in that work to believe there might be something going on here. Okay? So, there is some argument that can be made of a combinatorial nature. If you like combinatorics, you very use hard mathematics. But perhaps the way to say it, we're having to go to a combinatorics, is that when you have, which is there, again, we began to think that there are 4 ingredients, or there are 4 things that we can assume about seeds that have to do with the type of networks you find in seeds. That if these assumptions hold, and you then end up having different types of networks interacting with each other in a city, you will end up with the scaling relationships that I show you, and many more that I did not show you, but that are in the presentation. So our goal in the model was, can we build a model, as simple as it can, that will predict those scaling coefficients? And what we came up is this. We think that cities are in essence social networks embedded in space-time through infrastructure. So there's your answer. Well, that's our answer for what a city is. And this is what I believe Tenochtitlan, Barcelona, Chicago, and Cape Town have in common. Social networks embedded in space-time through infrastructure. Human beings agglomerate with their advantages to the social interactions that more than compensate for the cost. And we have them, they don't go away. The question is, what else do we get that the chimpanzees don't get? So we believe it's the social network. Yes.
Why is it taking us so long to get to the point where, I mean, 3 years ago that we passed the 50% mark, and we're gonna make a lot of quote-unquote progress on it this summer, but this century. But
That's a fascinating, that's a very, very good question. Very, very good question.
I mean, you've convinced me that living in a city or humanity is good in these respects. So,
Well, that's a very good question. That's a PhD worthy question.
no, I don't want to.
Okay, that's still a good question. Yes, you don't have to get a PhD to be a good, worthy human being.
My last name is Jacobs.
Wow, this is getting mystical. Last name is Jacobs, you care about cities, and don't want a PhD. But I can already tell that you're a much better human. Jane was brilliant, but she was very, 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 very nasty. Oh, she had an awful, awful mood. And if she knew you were an economist, and she hated us. Okay, this is Jane Jacobs. I cannot resist on this story because it has to do with Ed Glaser. So this economist at Glaser, you might know him, decided Jane was some birthday, she was getting old. He organized for her one of these things where you're about to die and they organize an event for you in the economics department at Harvard. Okay, lots of people came. It was 1997. The economics profession bowing down to Jane. Okay, and Jane actually agreed to leave Toronto to come to this event. That in itself was kind of like, wow. She came to the podium, and her very first words is, just because you organized this event, don't think that I dislike you any less. Okay, Jane, you hate economics class. Okay, so, where was I? Yeah. That's a very good question. So what I'm about to say now is completely in the realm of speculation, because certainly, and it's an answer, I don't know what happened 10,000, I don't know what happened 5,000 years ago.
Or I guess a better question, what's happening last century and this century?
There, if you think about economic development policy, let's take a case that I'm somewhat familiar with, Latin America. Over during the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and up into the 80s. It was a common policy objective of governments, whether on the left or the right, whether democratic or military dictatorship. The one thing that unified Latin American governments and USAID was that it was bad for cities to be large. It was a systematic policy objective to try to prevent cities from growing. There was this fetish made of the countryside. And so a lot of development policy, I would argue, even today, look at development policies in India. Well, I'm going to say something controversial, but don't quote me on this. But look at the economic development policy in the United States. Look at all the efforts that's spent to keep these people farming for no good reason, other than we somehow believe that, there's this anti-urban bias that I would argue has permeated policy for a long time. But that only explains the last 50 years. Obviously, there was something going on in terms of the transaction cost of why that move to first, why did urbanization start when it started, and why it's taking so long. Now, of course, this is the perspective we're taking today. And as of today, we have spent much more time being hunter-gatherers. Maybe 100,000 years from now, we'll look back and say, wow, we had this period of stupidity when we were hunter-gatherers, but then we clearly overcame it. But I don't know. It's actually a very, very good question.
And are those the one and the less than one and the greater than one constants you put up there, have those been true throughout human history as far as we can tell?
Another very good question. Only recently, in fact, only since last summer, have we begun to work with archaeologists. Okay, it's surprising when you think about how many disciplines have cared about cities. You can probably make a testament. There are economists, there are sociologists, there are archaeologists. it's very rare that we actually all meet. Say, hey, let's just get together and talk about cities. Okay? So it's only recently that I began to hang out with archaeologists. I have discovered archaeology. They're very cool people, you know, they're very smart, they do math, and they still go out and dig stuff in cool places. It sounds so much more interesting than a PhD in economics. Although I'm not discouraging anybody from getting a PhD in economics, okay? And so there are now some efforts trying to take data for ancient cities and see if the scaling relationship obtained. However, here's the challenge. It's difficult enough to answer the following question, for which we actually don't have a very precise answer. If I ask you, what is the population of Shanghai? I mean, that seems like an imminently answerable question, correct? I mean, just tell me, how many? Or if I ask you, how many people live in Cape Town? Cape Town is the major cities of Africa. Just how many people live in it? Yes, but what you're going to find is
23.479.
do you want to include the slums or not of Cape Town? So answering the question of how many people live in a place today is fair enough. Now I ask you, how many people live in Teotihuacan? Teotihuacan was the largest city in what is today Mexico. It was larger than Tenochtitlan, but it was before the Aztecs. So, I mean, we know it was large. There's a researcher, his name is George Cowell, I was mentioning earlier. He has spent 35 years career trying to answer the question. Can you imagine that? 35 years, you're obsessed. I want to know how many people live in Teotihuacan at its height. It's very difficult to answer. So it's very difficult, but there is some tantalizing evidence. There's a paper forthcoming in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that looks at some data that can be interpreted as data for economic output in some of the non-Aztec. So these are all qualifiers. There are some variables that can be interpreted as proxies for economic output for non-Aztec cities in the Valley of Mexico. Okay? And finds that they scale superlinearly in exactly the same way. Wow. So that paper is great. Or you think like, but there's so many ifs and so many qualifiers, please, why did you bother? Okay. So there is some hint, but one of the challenges for us is, we have challenges measuring things today. We have tremendous challenges measuring things in the past.
Even in like, say, I don't know, the 1800s.
Well, in the 1800s, we have good data, let's say, for the North American urban system, and that we have been examining. But if you want to get out of North America or Western Europe, which, you know, for other urban systems, but for good data that we have from the 19th century, yes, it holds. So these are the four things we assume. So there's your answer. Cities are social networks, but the social networks are embedded in space-time, okay? And they are social networks that are embedded in infrastructure. A city needs its population. Obviously, that's why you're in a city. That's why you want to live in a city, because you want to interact with some other people. Okay? There are some physical constraints to how you interact with other people and how many people you can interact. Okay? There are some features of the infrastructure networks that we can characterize. There is also some bounds on just human effort. You know, how much energy will that infrastructure network need to provide just for reproductive purposes. And then we can make an assumption that the social output of humans interacting through a network. But social output means ideas, creation, patents, inventions, physical work, wealth creation, wages, crimes, disease. Okay? Those are also where are somehow constrained, also in space-time. If you believe all these four assumptions and you bring them together, voila, you can recreate the scaling coefficient. And I believe our first paper about this was in an issue of Science that I think by now 3 weeks ago. Okay? But I would not be surprised if in 2 years, in 1 year, 5 years, someone says, look, this is just completely wrong. Okay? I wouldn't be surprised. I would be somewhat hurt, annoyed, but wouldn't be surprised. Okay? But what I think is essential is this notion of what is a city. If you believe that a city is primarily social networks embedded in space-time infrastructure, that does allow you to begin to think about cities in a synthetic way. Our challenge is to continue to expand the empirical range of our work. I just want to end by making a few remarks on them. This kind of provocative question that Jay Jacobs asked. Yes, inevitably, you cannot have a talk about cities that doesn't quote Jane. Okay, so here it is. I indeed quote Jane. I have fulfilled that. Where Jane asked in this fantastic book, she has this interesting question. What type of problem is a city? This is a thing. What type of problem is it? And what is tremendous about this book, I think this book was one of the first times that the ideas from complexity science, which went on to become very sexy, was actually brought into the social domain, where Jane argued that a city is a problem in organized complexity. They present situations in which half a dozen or even several dozen quantities are all variably simultaneously and in subtly interconnected ways. So the emphasis she put that the key to a city was interconnection. There is much that Jane got wrong. And we do have to acknowledge, after all, by now it's been 50 years since she wrote her book. Okay, this book. This is the 50th anniversary. Okay, it's a book that was funded by a small grant from the Rockefeller Foundation. Okay, $5,000, which at the time was not small. And there's much about, we cannot approach that book as a holy book. But the essential insight of a city as a network, I think Jane got right. So we can perhaps begin to answer the question, what is a city? What type of problem is a city? What type of theorizing does a city admit of? And all of that is exciting and fun. The question is it useful? And by the way, here's an article recently in the Smithsonian that actually does a fairly accurate job of characterizing the work. It's essentially one big giant math problem. Okay, isn't that satisfying? The larger question is this work useful? Meaning, is it useful for mayors? Is it useful for policymakers? Is it useful for the people who have to make decisions such as, do we give money to cities in decline? Or do we let them die? There was a very interesting discussion, by the way. It happened, and the decision was made, but if you remember, when Katrina happened, there was an instance in which a city received a tremendous shock, and there was an implicit discussion, and there were some voices, yes, Ed Glaser in London, who argued, let it die. Let it die.
Those people didn't like music.
No, so decisions are being made about cities. Some of them are very visible. They are the stuff of mayoral campaigns. But decisions are being made all the time. The World Bank has to decide what to do about cities, as they put it. Okay? For instance, in China, they have to decide, should they do anything to curtail the growth of Beijing or Shanghai? Should they let it rip? Or should they build 100 cities of 10 million people each? Now, by the way, that's not an academic. A few years ago, we had a workshop in Beijing sponsored by the National Academy of Sciences of China, and we were asked that question. Of course, if you're a scholar like me as an economist, I'm really terrified when people ever ask me, what should we do? Like, what? I have no idea. So there are questions to be made. The question is the scaling work going to be used or not? That, I admit, the verdict is out. I guess it will be shown in practice. But what I'd like to leave you with, to connect to the topic of data, is to emphasize how limited we still are in what data we have available. I already mentioned the example of GDP for cities. You will think that if you ask this straightforward question, what is the economic output that comes out of Chicago? Well, there's an answer to that. there's an answer that's available starting in 2004. That's when the Census Bureau began to report the equivalent of GDP for metropolitan areas in the United States, but only starting in 2001. And it is a huge effort. If you ask this straightforward question, what is the value of the economic output that comes out of Mexico City? Because I like to compare. Comparative analysis is often the first step to do something. I want to compare. I want to compare Chicago and St. Louis. I want to compare Chicago and Boston. I would like to compare Chicago and Cape Town in terms of the economic output. What is economic output? For most cities of the world, that data is not collected. If you ask questions of population, even if you ask questions of spatial extent, what are the spatial boundaries? What is the spatial extent of Lagos in Nigeria? What's the spatial extent of Johannesburg in South Africa? A lot of these questions we just don't have the answers to, and they severely limit what we can do. Therefore, not surprisingly, I'm going to conclude with an example of what I think is what we need to do as researchers is, we can sit around and wait for the Mexican equivalent of the Census Bureau to decide that it is important for them to measure the equivalent of GDP for Mexican metropolitan areas. I happen to know the head of research of the Mexican Census Bureau is a former graduate student of mine, and he assures me that it's simply not going to be in the agenda of the Mexican Census Bureau for the remainder of the 21st century to measure GDP in Mexican cities. Okay, so we can either sit back and say, well, that's too bad, or can we think of proxies? And I believe that increasingly, advances in our understanding of cities, if they're going to be fueled by data, which I hope they are, will have to result from people thinking hard about what is that we do have, or we can measure, that we can use as proxies for the things that we would like to get at. So one example of this, and it's a type of data that has become very sexy recently, is night and light data. You probably cannot see it from the day, but you have seen all these pictures of the world at night. The famous picture of the Korean Peninsula, like right in the south, or anything in the north. One of the things that people do in cities, they use electricity to create artificial light, and some of that light is, is reflected. We can measure it from satellites. Starting in 1997, researchers at NOAA, a federal agency, realized I don't know how they realized it, but they realized this, that if the Pentagon runs its own system of weather satellites, they don't like to rely on something else, and one of the instruments on those 4 satellites, as a byproduct of doing something else, measures light emitted at night from whatever electricity is used to generate light out in the open. So some of it are cities, some of it are gas flares, generate light. Somewhere in Asia, by the way, every night there's this gigantic moving city that appears and disappears. You know what that is? That's a Chinese fishing fleet. Leaving fishing. You can actually see it, and it's so humongous. You can see this blob, and then it goes. So you do have to be a little careful, like, well, is this a city or is this a fishing fleet at these gas flares? But they realized that that data is recorded. They negotiated with the Pentagon to have it released. Long story short, they did that. So there's been a whole research industry, a whole cottage industry, trying to use this night and light data to do things like capture the physical extent of urban areas. Which is the spatial boundary? Which is the extent of New Delhi? They've used this because you can use this data. This data is available since 1979. You can use this data to track the urbanization process in China and India. And it's why researchers like Karen Seto at Yale University argue that the speed and the scale of urbanization that's occurring in China and India is such as to truly be unprecedented, an often abused term, and that the urbanization process that we're now witnessing is qualitatively different from that which occurred in Europe or North America at the time of the Industrial Revolution. All of that is made possible only by this data, to the extent that you believe that this data is tracking, is following proxies for human activity. 2 years ago, NASA launched a satellite that has an instrument called VIRS. I don't bother you now with that acronym, but this is an instrument designed specifically to measure nighttime lights. Okay? Just remember that the VMSPOLS instrument captures nighttime lights as a byproduct. This is specifically designed to do so. It's beautiful data, it's crisper, has no saturation process, it's fantastic data. I guess I'm excited by nighttime light data, okay? And it's available for all of us to use. And so, here's a question. Is there some relationship between the nighttime lights, the light is artificially created using electricity that comes out of a place that we can identify as Mumbai? Okay, we can measure it. But this is London, by the way. Is there a relationship between this light and the GDP of the London metropolitan area? If there is, great, we have a way of measuring economic output for urban areas wherever we want to measure them. But you have to persuade yourself that there is a good relationship and there's work going on. There are some people, Vernon Henderson, Brown, who argue so. So to me, this is an example of what we're going to have to do more and more. Rely on things that are measured, not for research purposes. People don't think of research when they do cell phone calls. When they tweet each other, is that the verb tweet? To tweet? So I don't tweet myself, but I do know what it is. So people tweet each other. Oh, to tell each other whatever it is that they tell each other in tweets. Okay? Well, can we use that to infer something profound about social interactions? Okay? Does it tell me anything about, wow, I see that for a while, wasn't this guy Ashton Kutcher, the guy with the most tweet followers? Is that sociologically profound or really true? I mean, I don't know. Okay, but this is the type of stuff that we have. And I argue, and it's a challenge to all of you, to us, is can we capture what so far has evaded any of these efforts? And this, I conclude with your question, which is, we all believe, okay, fine, this is London. Yes, I agree, there's scaling, there's lights, there's human activity. But that's not what interests me. What interests me is that there are people there. And those people live in neighborhoods. And they engage in certain social interactions. And I like to capture that. And furthermore, I would like to see, can we account for the aggregate behavior of cities? What we measure at the macro level, or even the meso level, can we reconstruct it through macro level dynamics? Well, on the one hand, we say, well, obviously it must be the case. There has to be a connection between people doing stuff to each other or with each other there and those lives. Otherwise, but what is it? And so far, I have to argue the research into the dynamics of cities, whether it be urban economics, regional science, or work in urban scaling, is almost completely absent on how do you go from neighborhoods, assuming that that is an important social unit for most people, and what happens in the aggregate. That is, I would argue, a huge research frontier for which we have a tremendous and critical shortcoming. And the hope and dream of many of us is, wow, all this big data, all these tweets, all these cell phones, all these Facebook pages, all these sensors in cities, can we begin to capture some of these things without having to wait for the Census Bureau to measure it for us? But that won't happen. So, okay. Okay. No, you don't have to clap. If you want to see an endless array of scatter plots, or if you want to see some of the math, I'll be here until around 5. So, but now we can have a free-for-all discussion.
Okay, so, well, this will show you how limited my imagination is for asking questions, but do you know the lamppost joke?
I know some versions of it. Why are you looking under the lamppost? Because there's a light?
Yeah. You know, so a police officer is driving around the streets, you know, and he sees that there's a guy, you know, calling around, you know, by the curb. And so he goes over to him and says, "Sir, are you okay? Are you in trouble?" He says, "Oh, I dropped my keys." The officer says, "Well, let me go help you look for your keys." And so he gets down and they're looking for their keys, and after several minutes, the police officer says, "Well, are you sure you dropped your keys here? I really can't find it anywhere." And the guy says, "No, I dropped it half a block, you know, down." The police officer says, "Why are you looking here?" The guy says, "Well, because the light's better here."
And look, there's no shame in finding that to be really funny.
But well, you know, but I
Which
mentioned
at
it.
one point I did, I must admit.
Well, yeah, so I don't tell it because it's funny or, you know, not funny, but, you know, because it strikes me, you know, that there's a comparison here, you know, so, you know, the way that, you know, I hear the kind of point that you're opposing is, you know, there are many lampposts, you know, like, oh, look, you know, from night vision, you know, we can, you know, start to identify, you know, economic, you know, like economic activity, and, you know, and this ultimately can be a good measure for something that we're interested in. You know, so I kind of wanted to invite you to supply the answer. Or, you know, well, I mean, I have to make a point and ask you, you know, where we have light is not necessarily where the keys are. You know, if you want to study, you know, human interaction, Twitter shows you some light, but maybe not where, like, you know, the biggest meaning is. You know, so where are the keys, you know, what do you want to be able to measure? You know, be beyond what is available.
Can I invoke you? The example you were sharing with us at lunchtime of the work using cell phone interactions to try to capture neighborhood structure. Would you mind sharing that?
Right, I'm not, and then you're gonna make the link, I hope, to how this is.
Well, hopefully the link will be made by itself.
So, yeah, so one of the things we're trying to do is to say that this conception of neighborhood has been based primarily on geographic boundaries that are imposed, right, administratively. And so what we're really interested in doing is trying to understand how people move in neighborhood space, and what might be more consequential is people's activity space rather than just their residential location. So what we're trying to do both with kids and with older adults is to track their activity space via cell phones. And so we ping them every so often so we know where they're going, and then 3 times a day we conduct a social survey that prompts them to answer key questions like who you're with, how you feel, and some questions about health status that are randomly, it's based on the work of Jason Matthias and none of that, an idea of flow, so that we're not asking for retrospective assessments, we're actually asking for people to tell us how they feel in the moment. I think that our hope is that this is one way of redefining neighborhood effects research, at least in urban sociology, such that it isn't, as I'm saying, kind of contingent on making assumptions about where people go and that they move generally within their census tracts, let's just say.
You know, why? Okay, let me start with
So I'll hand it over to you.
Well, I mean, for a lot of the things that we have mentioned, okay, let's take, I don't want to do the impression that I'm upset with GDP, but GDP is a good variable. Like, okay, GDP might be of interest in its own right, yes, your economies, the dollar value, what comes out of a place. But for some of us, we care about GDP because we believe, well, underlying that value to the variable are people interacting with other people in the process of creating wealth. So I use GDP data as a very indirect way to capture that which I'm more interested in, which I have no idea how will I go about capturing people's interacting with each other in the act of creating wealth. Well, gee, that's kind of hard. Here's GDP. For almost every one of the variables that we have examined, that others have examined, that urban sociologists, is this notion of what really we would like to see, but we can't, are the interactions. So how do we make those interactions visible? Now, so far, let's say up until, I don't know, I don't date this, but let's say up until the Twitter, Facebook, cell phone age, what we did is, well, I'm going to take what we have, GDP. Or let's take another example, population density. You know, most economic models have measured population density almost simple-mindedly. Take the population of Chicago divided by the land area of the Chicago metropolitan area, there's population density. this is my measure of social interaction. Wow, really? Well, you know, what about the parks, the empty lots? Can you have two places with the same population density? One where people have high quality interactions and one not? All of that is completely lost. But look, I have population data, I have land area, I can make a ratio, and I can argue that population density is how I capture social interaction. Now, because that is such a poor measure, it might not surprise you that after 20, 25 years of doing regression analysis, like there's no tomorrow, it turns out that population density is a very poor statistical value. So even though we have lots of good theoretical reasons to say, no, interactions, density matter, when you go to the cold econometrics, the paper that you get published in the Journal of Urban Economics, most models, the variable for population density, it's very weak. So you can conclude two things. Aha, I knew it all along. It doesn't matter. You know, people are homoeconomicus. You know, they're okay. They're like each other. You know, they don't have their own copy of Ayn Rand. You know, I have to measure her. If you mention them, JJ goes here to me. Or there's just something really wrong with that variable, as if what you're trying to capture is social interactions. Why don't we try to capture social interactions more directly? Up until recently, most economists said, how do I do that? But now, so the question is, are we now in a stage where we can actually measure more directly what we want to measure and not be so confined to the lamppost of, look, statistical offices? And I do not want to in any way minimize the tremendous effort that goes into reporting what's reported by the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But maybe we are now in a new era. Maybe through Twitter or Facebook or cell phone interaction or sensors or all these cameras. Maybe it's going to be good not just for the NSA but for urban economics. Sorry, I had to make I like it. I had to bring an NSA joke talking about big data. But I don't know, okay? That's you'll be the guys telling us. Soon, I guess.
So this is kind of a future directions question, but a lot of us are in a position where we're either still within PhD programs or sort of at decision points in our career about the kinds of things we're going to be doing and as next steps. And I hear this presentation, and to me, it's a bit abstract, and it sort of drops a lot of ideas of using big data and data science and look at all the things we can do. And it seems like, okay, what we're talking about here is just sort of the advancement of science. Like, you know, we're all doing new things and we're learning new things, etc. And then when we get down to like the concrete details, the practicalities, we start saying, okay, there's new kinds of data. So we've got satellite data, or mobile phone data, Facebook, Twitter. And I'm wondering, since we didn't really get as much of an insight into the kind of work that you're doing particularly, rather than the sort of this just general level, is there a case you can make, or do you have thoughts for why should we, in considering our next steps, why should we think, if we want to be part of this sort of these advances and really push forward our understanding and knowledge, why should we do that within like the university or the kind of position you're in, rather than in places where they really are, they seem to be like engaged in extending the kind of data collection we can do, because we're never really going to get to this point unless we really begin to develop new kinds of data and extend, you know. In other words, the technical part is really what makes a difference from my perspective. So, right, why work at a university and do this kind of thing rather than at Facebook, where they're developing the tools and doing the science? Yeah, the researchers sometimes get a hold of that data, but it's not really where they're making the real example. So
Well, I think that's a very, very good question. And I think my answer would be, we need, by all means, we need both. I hope you do not get the sense that I said, you know, whatever you might call it, university research. I think we need to do both.
Well, I'm sorry, just to be a little more specific, what I'm asking is, can you give a pitch for why what you're, like, what the university is doing is really helping push the advancement?
I don't know if I can make a pitch, but I can make an analogy. I'm gonna bring in which the analogy either is gonna be very convincing or it's gonna be to you an example of the problem. But let's consider the following. If and yes, the analogy is gonna come from physics, a domain close to my heart. But I think it's relevant. Okay? In let's go back to 1927. Okay, before, yeah, way back in the piece of time. So in 1927 was a period of time that saw a tremendous burst of activity in nuclear physics that eventually came to be known as quantum mechanics. People heard about it, it's very weird, completely counterintuitive. No one really understands what it means, but it works. And in 1927 specifically, there was a very famous conference that came to be known as the Savoy Conference, because it was held in the Savoy